Front page of our local paper that Saturday was this appalling photograph. I can't read. I need that. Thanks so much. Appalling photograph you see here of the local zoo's two elephants. Winky was in front and Penny was standing behind her. And as you can see, they were in a lake of their own liquid and solid waste. This is because they were chained in place every night for 16.5 hours every day of the year. Below the photo was a brief article stating that a local community group was raising questions about whether Henry Vilas Zoo had adequate resources to care for them. I decided to go down and see for myself. I met the local activists, Julie Borodine and Betsy Monroe, and I listened to them, and I looked, and I finally saw. And it was the most radicalizing educational experience of my life. That afternoon began a several-year process of systematically educating myself about elephants in the zoo industry. Over that time, I introduced myself to key policymakers within AZA, leaders of the elephant sanctuary movement and animal protection world. As time went on, my own advocacy alternated between campaigns for individual animals at specific zoos and efforts to bring about systemic change in the zoo industry. But the first thing I did was join the cause that day. And 1 year later, in the summer of 2000, we got both the elephants out and the elephant exhibit permanently closed. How did that happen? Well, our campaign took fire when the local press rallied to our cause, and Winky tried to kill the zoo's vet, a visiting circus vet, and her keepers just before Christmas. That nearly fatal encounter occurred during zoo hours. The vets and staff were hauled away in ambulances, and news trucks were on the scene in no time. So the near tragedy galvanized the community as a whole, but more importantly, at that point, it embarrassed the Dane County exec. And that is an elected official whose office owns and governs the zoo. The county exec's office ultimately turned to our little group for advice and counsel on options other than keeping Penny and Winky at the zoo. AZA and the zoo, of course, fought back, and we ended up in a draw. Penny, the African female, had been orphaned by elephant culls in Zimbabwe around 1980. As a baby herself, she was imported to Florida by the fellow who invented Nautilus fitness equipment. So she was part of the group that's called the Nautilus Group. Penny was almost immediately sold to Vilas Zoo in 1982 and spent 2 decades there with Winky. As a result of our campaign, she was moved to Riverbank Zoo. Now, that was not an ideal outcome by any stretch, but it still gave her a measurably better life because Riverbanks, unlike Vilas, was committed to protected contact. South Carolina's climate is, of course, far closer to Africa than Wisconsin's. And she finally laid eyes after 20 years on members of her own kind, other African elephants. It's worth noting, I think, that she bonded deeply with one of them, an elephant by the name of Belle. And so I think she was less lonely the rest of her life than she had been the first 20 years. Winky, however, won the jackpot. With the invaluable leadership of Carol Buckley, the Dane County exec finally decided to send Winky to the elephant sanctuary. Winky moved in September 2000 and found a faithful friend in Sissy. Unlike Penny, Winky had hundreds of acres to explore and a life as nearly wild as is possible for an elephant in the United States. After our successful one-year campaign in Madison, I focused my advocacy inside AZA. I joined AZA as an associate member, attended its conferences, and developed relationships throughout the industry. My overriding impression in the early 2000s was that conservation and science had little impact on how American zoos treat their elephants. It was also my impression that AZA's elephant management standards have done little more than enshrine existing space enrichment and socialization opportunities that zoos already offered, no matter how paltry they were. Sadly, I believe this assessment remains largely accurate nearly 20 years later. In any event, I focused my efforts between 2000 and 2004 lobbying AZA's board to adopt protected contact and to amend its elephant management standards to protect the lifelong bond between elephant mothers and their daughters. In 2004, the board and AZA zoo directors finally took up my protected contact proposal and voted it down. They refused to even consider addressing a rule to protect mothers and daughters from separation. That's when I concluded that working inside AZA was futile, and I returned to the streets. So I began collaborating then with the Friends of Maggie campaign, a community group in Anchorage, Alaska, that was founded by Penelope Wells. Alaska Zoo, Maggie's home, was a privately owned zoo. Alaska Zoo had a tortuous history when it comes to elephants. The intersection of elephants and Anchorage began around 1965 when a toilet paper selling contest run through grocery stores in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska was held. The first prize offered to the store selling the most toilet paper was $15,000 or a baby Asian elephant. Yeah. The grocery store in Anchorage won and took the elephant. As the short winter ended and winter approached, the store manager was anxious to get rid of the baby elephant tied up outside the store, you can imagine. So a local couple, John and Sammy Sewell, stepped up and said they would take the baby, now called Annabelle, to their homestead, what was then on the edge of Anchorage. They put her in a heated stall in their barn, where they already had an injured harbor seal living in a bathtub. Every weekend, neighbors would bring their children to visit the baby elephant, and so that zoo was born. The Sewells' homestead, 40 acres, became the footprint of today's Alaska Zoo. Maggie, who joined Annabelle, was also purchased from the Nautilus Group around 1982. Annabelle sadly died from foot rot in the mid-90s, and from then on, Maggie lived alone. Until one day, Penelope Wells saw her and decided she needed to go to sanctuary. Much like the situation in Madison, the Maggie campaign enjoyed sympathetic press and strong community support. However, we lacked political leverage. The Sewells, who many years later still dominated the zoo board, were determined to keep Maggie despite her desperate social and environmental impoverishment. I'll give you here's a picture of her lovely indoor living conditions. The city political elite was reluctant to criticize because the zoo was one of their few cultural assets. Still, we kept Maggie's plight on the front page and in the local news from time to time, and we also kept in touch with the local politicians, pointing out the zoo's shortcomings and lobbying for Maggie's retirement. In many ways, the zoo's repeatedly tarnished its own credibility throughout this time. For example, and to great fanfare, it spent $1 million building a treadmill for Maggie that she could supposedly exercise on during the long winter months. However, Maggie refused to step on it. Finally, Maggie, like Winky, decided she'd had enough, and she collapsed in front of horrified zoo guests on Mother's Day in 2007. The zoo, unprepared for the calamity, called the Anchorage Fire Department, and they came and they did get Maggie back up on her feet, but it did cause a public relations fiasco for the zoo. The mayor and city council were incensed, and because they realized they had narrowly missed a potential catastrophe had there been a house fire while the zoo department was busy tied up at the zoo trying to get Maggie back up. So the following day, it was as though the light bulb finally went on. The following day, the city council unanimously adopted a resolution calling on the zoo to allow Maggie to retire, and the mayor approved it. This public loss of confidence in the zoo by the local political elite spelled the end of Maggie's miserable life in Alaska. Pat Derby and Ed Stewart of PAWS, along with the remarkable Bob Barker, went to work. And they labored the whole summer, and they finally were able to bring Maggie home to PAWS, ARC 2000, in October 2007, where she continues to thrive to this day. Now, there's a great picture of her. Yeah, when she first arrived, she couldn't even really hold her head up. You know, her neck muscles had atrophied so much from lack of use, you know, because of her living condition. So, I mean, really is a bit of a miracle how fit she is now. It was during this time that I and many others founded the Coalition for Captive Elephant Well-Being. Our group was broad-based of representatives from major animal welfare groups, 2 progressive zoos, leading scientists, and thought leaders like Gay Bradshaw and Robert Atkinson, David Hancock, and Pete Stroud, and founders of the premier elephant sanctuaries in the United States, Carol Buckley and Pat Derby. Our purpose was to develop best practices for the care of elephants in captivity, predicated on peer-reviewed scientific evidence. The coalition sponsored a symposium at Tufts University's vet school, where everyone gathered, gave their papers, and debated. All of this was eventually published in a book by Tufts University in 2009. I do want to note, note a bit of personal pride, and that is that the government of South Africa formally adopted our best practices to govern the practices of entities within their borders that hold elephants. So that was great. Thank you. No, that's nice. Thank you. Yeah. Now, as the book was winding its way to publication, I went to Michigan State University School of Law to do some research, and I had the opportunity that was provided to me by Adam Roberts of Born Free USA to look at the case file of their mammoth undertaking to stop the import of Swaziland elephants back in 2003. After studying the files, I drafted a law review article on an issue raised in the case but was never fully briefed. This wasn't due to the fault of anyone. It had to do with the terrible time constraints imposed on the parties and on the judge, because the King of Swaziland kept threatening to kill the elephants if they weren't promptly put on planes and shipped to the US. Now, the question, though, that the case raised but never faced and never answered was, is a zoo's exhibition of elephants primarily a commercial activity? CITES actually prohibits the international trade of endangered species for primarily commercial purpose. So if the answer to that question is yes, then its own language should prohibit the international movement of elephants, wild caught from Africa or Asia, to US zoos. Now, this legal question has never been squarely addressed, but my legal research indicated, I believe, strong legal and policy arguments to support it. My article was published in the Journal of Animal Law, which is a journal published by the Michigan State University School of Law, in 2010. If you would like a link to it, please see me at the break. As you undoubtedly know, the zoo industry resorted to another import of wild-caught elephants in Swaziland in 2016. Again, there was a legal challenge, this time by Friends of Animals, and before the trial court heard its first hearing in the lawsuit, the zoos had already moved the elephants in the dead of night and had brought them to the United States, so the case was moot and dismissed. Now, I believe, as I'm sure many of you do, that the zoo industry's unyielding ambition to exhibit elephants, their miserable record of captive breeding, and the industry's 2 wins so far in court is going to embolden them to go back to Swaziland and do it again. And when they do, I sincerely hope that counsel for the animal protection side of the controversy will weaponize case management to secure the status of the animals in their home range country, and then fully argue our contention that the zoo's importation of elephants for exhibition is primarily commercial and therefore prohibited. My third and last individual elephant campaign commenced in 2011 when I joined forces with Aileen Fortgang and Nancy Pennington, founders of Friends of Woodland Park Zoo Elephants in Seattle. Like previous campaigns, our campaign developed superb relationships with the press and unbelievably strong public support. This is Watoto. She was the solitary African elephant at the zoo. Again, there was a crisis in the barn. This time, the collapse and death of Watoto, Woodland Zoo's single African elephant. And that was in August of 2014. Watoto's death did provide sufficient momentum to force the zoo to close the elephant exhibit, but not enough momentum to influence where the remaining elephants, 2 Asian females, Chai, here's Chai getting a foot bath, or getting prepared for a foot bath, and Bamboo, where they went. And it was not for lack of trying. We lobbied City Hall tirelessly, created and took advantage of every press and media opportunity that came our way. Aileen led the charge on demonstrations, vigils, press conferences, and marches. We were interviewed repeatedly on television and radio. We flooded Seattle City Council meetings, gave testimony, and provided experts. We filed state court and federal court lawsuits. But Woodland Park held 3 critical advantages that we were unable to overcome. 1, it was managed by the Woodland Park Zoological Society, whose board is huge. It has 40 members. And it was populated mainly by people who are members of the political donor class in Seattle. Both contingencies were insurmountable for us. Because of the size of the board, we were never able to influence a critical number at one time fast enough, to get anyone to change their mind. The second problem, of course, was that the politicians were fearful of antagonizing board members. Woodland Park Zoo's second advantage were the circumstances surrounding Watoto's death. She went down overnight, and so the zoo did not open that part of the zoo again until she had been euthanized and removed. This allowed the zoo to control the public story and avoid acute embarrassment. And the third advantage, of course, was that no court in Washington, whether state or federal, ruled in our favor. Even when the federal court agreed with our contention that Woodland Park Zoo was a miserable place for an elephant, it refused to order the zoo to give up its elephants or move them to sanctuary. So Woodland Park Zoo got its way, and Chai and Bamboo were moved to Oklahoma City Zoo. This, in my view, was a terrible decision. Chai, only 37, died, within months of her arrival. And Bamboo is still there, but she lives in near solitary confinement because they've never been able to successfully integrate her into the group that's there. So what is my main takeaway from the last 19 years is that fighting for elephants is really hard, but I'm sure at the same time you would agree with me that elephants, who have been much better friends to us than we have ever been to them, do deserve our best efforts. Because that's what it's supposed to look like. So I better close now. Okay, thanks.